So a few years, usually when we talk about a set of rules, there is this underlying expectation of precision. It's kind of like engineering.
Right, yeah, like structural math.
Exactly. If
Yeah.
you want to build a suspension bridge, you have to calculate the load-bearing capacity. You measure the tension of the steel cables, the wind resistance, all those shear forces. And at the end of the day, the engineer just, taps the math on the chalkboard and says, there it is, it will hold.
It's binary. I mean, it either holds the weight of the traffic or it completely collapses into the river.
Yeah.
There's really no in between there.
Yeah, it's clean, it's measurable, and honestly, for our human brains, it is deeply comforting. We like things to be categorical. But then you step out of the engineering bay and you walk into the world of visual communication, graphic design, and art, and suddenly that calculator is just broken.
Oh, entirely broken.
We're no longer looking at physics, right? We are looking at this wild landscape of human perception, emotion, and cognitive processing that is honestly incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. But here is the critical distinction that people miss. Just because the math isn't strictly numerical, that doesn't mean there isn't an underlying physics to it.
Right.
There actually is a science to how our eyes move, how our brains process visual weight, and how we physically react to a layout on a page or a glowing screen.
And that hidden physics is exactly what we are decoding for you today. We are taking a masterclass in the foundational laws of visual communication. Specifically, we're doing a deep dive into the 6th chapter of the book, Graphic Design for Dummies, and this chapter is titled, The Principles of Design, Balance, Contrast, and Emphasis.
It's such a crucial chapter.
It really is. And the mission here is, whether you are a novice designer trying to figure out why your flyer looks terrible, or a marketer trying to increase your conversions, or honestly just a curious person who wants to know why certain apps or billboards captivate you while others just, they give you an instant headache.
Yeah, visual fatigue is real.
Understanding these principles is the ultimate shortcut to being visually literate. You don't need a fine arts degree to understand what the author wants to tell the reader here. You just need to know the invisible framework that's been built around you.
And, it's a framework that has been under construction for centuries. I think that's important to remember. These principles, balance, contrast, emphasis, they aren't arbitrary rules cooked up by some Silicon Valley tech company to make an app interface look sleek.
They're way older than that.
Exactly. They are the distilled result of generations of artists, Renaissance painters, Gothic architects, and modern visual communicators who have been constantly experimenting with the human optical system.
So when you understand and apply these principles, you are quite literally standing on the shoulders of giants. Every time a designer sits down at a blank canvas or, an empty digital artboard, they do not have to reinvent the wheel.
Right. They can lean into lifetimes of investigation.
Exactly. And before we get completely lost in the fascinating psychology of all this, because we really are going to go deep today, I want to throw a quick reminder out there to you. Producing this kind of in-depth, tailored content, the kind that truly respects your time and your intelligence rather than just, skimming the surface of a topic, it takes a massive amount of effort. So if you want us to keep pulling back the curtain on these deep dives, please support the channel. It's what keeps this conversation going.
And it's a conversation that really requires a bit of nuance. Because while we are calling these the laws of design, the author makes sure to establish a major caveat right up front in the chapter.
Right. I like to think of these design principles like the laws of physics when you're building a house. Now, you don't have to follow traditional blueprints. You can experiment.
Yeah, you can get weird with it.
You can, and using these rules doesn't automatically guarantee you're going to build a masterpiece like Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. But if you ignore gravity, if you ignore load distribution, your house is going to physically collapse.
That's a perfect analogy.
In design, ignoring these principles usually leads to a structure that visually collapses. It results in a layout that just feels off to the viewer, even if they can't articulate exactly why it makes them uncomfortable.
It is a great analogy, but the caveat is that design is not entirely rigid. The execution of these laws is always filtered through a designer's their visual voice.
Their personal aesthetic style, right?
Yes. So there is a universal consensus on the core principles, but how a designer prioritizes them or bends them or interprets them that constitutes their unique visual voice. And we really cannot overstate how heavily that voice is influenced by cultural context.
Oh, this is huge.
The physics of design shift dramatically depending on the cultural lens of the audience you're designing for.
I actually struggle with this idea of visual voice versus cultural rules sometimes. Because think about it, if I'm a designer working in New York, and my personal aesthetic leans heavily into certain spatial arrangements, but I'm suddenly commissioned to design a campaign for an Arabic-speaking audience, my instinct to put the logo on the top left is completely wrong, isn't it?
It is 100% wrong, yeah.
I have to actively fight my own visual voice.
You absolutely do, because in the West, we read left to right, top to bottom. So our eyes are biologically, or at least culturally trained to gravitate to the top left corner of a page as the starting point of any visual journey.
Right.
But in cultures where languages are read right to left, that entire spatial prioritization just flips. If you put your most critical piece of information in the top left for an Arabic or Hebrew-speaking audience, you are essentially putting it at the end of their visual journey, not the beginning.
Or consider color symbolism, right? A color that represents mourning and death in one culture might represent joy or purity or celebration in another.
Exactly. Which means a designer has to tread incredibly carefully. The book strictly warns against cultural appropriation here. You cannot separate design from its cultural payload.
Yeah, you can't just slap a geometric pattern on something.
Right. A graphic designer should never use elements, symbols, or structural formats from other cultures without a profound, thoroughly researched understanding of their significance. You can't just borrow a piece of typography because it looks cool.
You have to understand the historical and cultural weight it carries. It's about respect, but it's also just about accuracy. To communicate effectively, you have to actually speak the visual language you're borrowing.
Precisely. So with those foundational boundaries established, let's move into the actual mechanics of Chapter 6. Step 1 of building anything is establishing the foundation. You can't start hanging the curtains until the floorboards are level.
So we start with Section 1, the psychology of balance.
And balance is completely non-negotiable. Before a designer can make elements pop or draw the eye to a specific call to action, they first have to ensure the composition isn't making the viewer physically uncomfortable.
Okay, wait, let's dig into that physical discomfort. What actually happens to a human being when a design is unbalanced? Because that sounds extreme.
Well, when visual balance is off, it creates a literal feeling of tension or anxiety or discord in the viewer.
Physical tension from looking at a piece of paper or a glowing screen. That is wild to me.
It is wild, but it makes evolutionary sense if you think about it. Our brains are constantly, subconsciously seeking equilibrium in our environment.
Like checking if we're going to fall over.
Exactly. We use visual cues to determine if we are standing upright, if a tree is about to fall on us, or if the ground is stable. So when a layout is visually lopsided, say, all the heavy dark text and massive images are crammed into the bottom right corner and the rest of the page is completely empty, our brain registers that as unstable.
It feels like the page is going to tip over.
Right. Balance in design is the deliberate distribution of visual elements to achieve a sense of stability. It ensures no single part of a design accidentally overpowers the rest.
Okay, so let's break down the actual methodologies of balance from the chapter, starting with the one we are all most familiar with, symmetrical balance.
Symmetrical balance is definitely the simplest to grasp. It's achieved when elements are arranged evenly around a central axis. Basically, it creates a mirror image.
Like folding a piece of paper in half.
Yeah, exactly. And you can break this down into horizontal balance, where the left and right sides mirror each other perfectly across a vertical line, and vertical balance, where the top and bottom halves mirror each other across a horizontal line.
It's the Rorschach test. It's the wings of a butterfly. But mechanically, why do we use it in graphic design? What is the psychological impact of seeing a perfectly mirrored layout?
Symmetrical balance is almost universally associated with feelings of formality, supreme stability, and institutional order. Think about the architecture of a government building, like the Supreme Court. Or think about a highly traditional, really expensive wedding invitation. The text is perfectly centered, the margins are identical, it is predictable, it is exceptionally safe.
It tells the brain everything is under control here, there are rules, and we are following them.
Exactly. It projects authority and permanence.
It's the visual equivalent of a perfectly tailored tuxedo. But, as much as I respect a great tuxedo, if every piece of design in the world was symmetrical, it would be incredibly boring.
Oh, totally. It's very static.
Which brings us to the second, much more complex type, asymmetrical balance. Now, here is where my brain used to short circuit when I first started studying design. If the two sides of a layout do not match, if they are fundamentally different shapes, sizes, and colors, how does it not feel lopsided?
It's the magic trick of design.
Yeah, how are you achieving balance without symmetry?
That is the crucial hurdle every novice designer has to clear. And it introduces a concept that dictates almost all modern design: visual weight. Asymmetrical balance does not rely on mirroring elements. It relies on arranging completely disparate elements in a way that their visual weight counterbalances each other.
Visual weight. Okay, I know you can't put a JPEG on a scale, so how do we measure this?
Think of a playground seesaw. Symmetrical balance is like putting two children of the exact same physical weight on opposite ends of the seesaw at the exact same distance from the center fulcrum.
The board is perfectly level.
Right. But asymmetrical balance is like putting a 200-pound adult on one side of the seesaw and a 50-pound child on the other side.
If they sit at the same distance, the adult crashes to the ground.
Exactly. But if you move the adult very close to the center fulcrum and you move the child all the way out to the very edge of the board, you can achieve perfect equilibrium.
Oh, wow.
The elements on the board are completely different, but the tension between them is balanced.
That makes so much sense. So how does that translate to ink on a page or pixels on a screen?
In design, certain characteristics make an element feel heavier to the eye. Dark colors feel heavier than light colors. Large objects feel heavier than small ones. Complex, highly textured shapes feel heavier than simple, smooth shapes.
So you mix and match those properties.
Right, so you might have a massive light yellow simple circle taking up the entire left side of a poster. To balance that immense size, you don't need another giant circle on the right.
Because that would just be symmetry.
Yes. Instead, you can place a very tiny, incredibly dense, dark red, highly textured square in the bottom right corner. The dark color, the sharp corners, and the texture give that tiny square a massive amount of visual weight, allowing it to anchor the entire right side of the composition against the giant airy circle on the left.
It's an intuitive balancing act, and the emotional result is entirely different from symmetry, isn't it?
Completely different. Asymmetry evokes energy. It creates a sense of movement and tension. Almost all cutting-edge modern design solutions lean heavily on asymmetrical balance to create a fresh, innovative, organic aesthetic. It feels alive. It feels less rigid and, much more unpredictable.
I remember reading an anecdote from the author in this chapter about this exact thing. They were talking about photographing their own portfolio work to put on their website.
Oh yeah, the photography example.
Right. They noticed that whenever they set up the shots perfectly symmetrically, business card exactly in the center, lighting perfectly even, people would glance at it and just scroll past.
This is boring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when they set up the shots asymmetrically, like the business card off to the bottom left, a pen angling in from the top right, a heavy shadow anchoring the opposite corner, viewers spent significantly more time looking at the image. They found it more engaging.
And there's a neurological reason for that. With perfect symmetry, the brain processes one half of the image, assumes the other half is exactly the same, says, I get it, and moves on to conserve energy.
It's lazy. Our brains are lazy.
Totally. But with asymmetry, the brain has to work a tiny bit harder to resolve the balance. It has to calculate the visual weight of the pen versus the shadow versus the card. It invites the human eye to actively explore the image rather than just passively absorbing it. It holds your attention.
But there has to be a risk there, right? Because if you calculate the visual weight wrong, you're back to making the viewer feel physically anxious.
Oh, it's high risk, high reward. Asymmetrical balance is significantly harder to pull off successfully than symmetry. If the viewer interprets the visual weight differently than the designer intended, the design just looks broken.
Okay, so we have symmetry for order and asymmetry for dynamic energy. What are the other structural models for balance mentioned in the book?
There are two others that are incredibly effective: radial balance and crystallographic balance.
Radial balance sounds like a bicycle spoke or a car tire.
Exactly. Radial balance occurs when elements radiate outward from a central focal point or pull inward toward it. Think of a sunburst or the petals of a daisy or a spiral staircase viewed from above.
I can picture that.
Because everything in the composition is either pulling the eye to a single gravitational center or exploding outward from it, it creates an intense, almost hypnotic sense of movement.
It's incredibly dramatic. And then there's the one that sounds like a 400-level chemistry class. Crystallographic balance. Some people just call it mosaic balance, right?
Yeah, mosaic balance is easier to say. And this one is profoundly beautiful when executed well. Crystallographic balance is achieved by giving equal visual weight to a large number of elements across the entire composition, but deliberately, without any specific focal point.
It's balanced chaos.
Yes. It is not necessarily a symmetrical, rigid grid. It's a multitude of elements combining to make a unified textural whole.
We see this all the time in nature, don't we? Like the arrangement of a snowflake under a microscope, or the random but harmonious patterns in a slab of granite or quartz. In human-made design, the greatest historical examples the author brings up are Islamic architecture and mosaic art like the intricate tile work in the Alhambra. You have these infinitely repeating geometric design elements forming a cohesive whole across an entire domed ceiling. But what does that do to us emotionally? Why did ancient architects spend decades building like that?
It's all about how it alters brainwave states. Crystallographic balance evokes profound feelings of calm, orderliness, and spiritual stability.
Wow, just from looking at tiles.
Yes, because there is no single focal point demanding your immediate attention. No giant red arrow saying, "Look here." Your eye is allowed to wander freely across a structured, infinite landscape. It creates an overarching effect of harmony.
It's soothing.
It really is. It tells the deepest part of the brain. There are rules here, they are infinite, and they are beautiful. It literally lowers stress.
Okay, so we've built our stable foundation, we've arranged the visual furniture in the room so the floor doesn't feel tilted, and we aren't inducing anxiety in our audience. But here's the problem with pure stability.
It puts you to sleep.
Exactly. If a room is perfectly harmonious, perfectly safe, and completely balanced, I'm probably going to fall asleep. Harmony without friction is invisible. If you want the viewer to actually wake up and process a specific message, you have to introduce conflict.
Which brings us smoothly to section 2 of our deep dive. The art of conflict, or mastering contrast.
Contrast introduces the necessary friction to make elements stand out or recede. I think of it as the volume knob of design.
That is exactly how you should think about it. Contrast refers to the deliberate differences between visual elements that make them distinguishable from one another. It is the fundamental tool that allows a designer to control visual interest, organize information, and establish a visual hierarchy.
Let's talk about the functional side of that for a second before we get into the aesthetics, because contrast isn't just about making things look cool, it is a critical component of accessibility.
Absolutely. If we look at legibility, particularly for visually impaired individuals or even just people reading a screen in bright sunlight, contrast is life or death for the design.
If there isn't enough contrast, you just can't read it.
Right. If there isn't enough tonal contrast between your text and your background, your message is literally invisible.
And even beyond ADA compliance and accessibility, contrast is how you remove ambiguity. Like if you have a web page with 10 different buttons and they're all the exact same light blue color, the user is paralyzed.
They don't know what to click.
Exactly. But if you increase the contrast of the checkout button by making it bright, saturated orange, the ambiguity vanishes. The user knows exactly what they're supposed to do.
But here is the secret weapon of contrast that a lot of novice designers miss. It isn't just used to emphasize things. It is equally powerful when used to de-emphasize elements.
Oh, I love this concept. If everything is loud, nothing is loud.
Precisely. If every piece of text on a poster is neon green, your brain just registers a wall of noise. A master designer lowers the contrast on secondary information, like the copyright text or the background texture, so it actively recedes.
By making the unimportant things quieter, the high contrast elements shine even brighter without having to shout.
Yes. So let's look at the actual levers on this control panel. How do we create contrast? Let's start with color and tonal contrast.
Okay, lay at us.
For color contrast, designers manipulate 4 key aspects: hue, lightness, saturation, and temperature.
Let's break this down.
Hue is simply the difference between colors on the color wheel, like pairing a red against a green. Lightness is exactly what it sounds like, how pale or dark a color is. Saturation is the purity or intensity of the color, so a neon pink versus a dusty, muted rose. And temperature is the friction between warm colors, like yellows and oranges, against cool colors, like purples and icy blues.
Let me give you an example from the book that perfectly illustrates how color contrast isn't just pretty, but actually participates in the meaning of a message. It was an advertising campaign that used simple text jokes.
About the billboard jokes.
Yeah, so on the first billboard, the text read, "What do you call a guy who's had too much to drink?" And the punchline, "a cab," was written in this violently bright red text against a stark white background, while the setup text was a calm green. It was incredibly high contrast.
And mechanically, why do they design it that way?
Because it's a punchline, it needs to hit you in the face. The visual contrast actually delivers the abrupt, snappy timing of the joke. It does the work of a comedian's delivery.
Exactly.
But then, on the next billboard, they had a different joke. I went to buy camouflage pants, but I couldn't find any. And this entire billboard was designed with virtually zero color contrast. The text was a slightly darker olive green against a medium olive green background.
You probably had to squint to even read it.
You really did. It leaned entirely into the premise of the joke that camouflage is notoriously difficult to see. The low contrast wasn't a mistake. The design was literally acting out the punchline.
That perfectly demonstrates that contrast is semantic. It carries meaning. Now, it's important to distinguish color contrast from tonal contrast.
Right, they aren't the same thing.
Not at all. Tonal contrast relies purely on brightness, the measure of an element's lightness or darkness, entirely independent of its hue. You could achieve massive tonal contrast using only black, white, and grays.
Which is why a black and white photograph can still be incredibly striking. There's a trick designers use to check their tonal contrast, right? The squint test.
Yes, the squint test is essential. If you have a complex layout, step back and squint your eyes until the image goes blurry. When you squint, you stop seeing the details, you stop reading the words, and you stop processing the specific hues.
You just see the blobs.
Exactly. What remains highly visible is the tonal contrast, the relationship between the giant blobs of light and dark. If your layout turns into a solid, muddy, gray rectangle when you squint, your tonal contrast is failing.
Think about a novelty t-shirt that says, if you can read this, your glasses are doing their job. If the designer uses high tonal contrast like black text on a white shirt, everyone can read it from across the street, which ruins the joke.
The joke is dead on arrival.
Right. But if they use low tonal contrast, dark charcoal gray text on a black shirt, people actually have to step closer and strain their eyes to read it, which forces them to interact with the joke. The contrast dictates the physical behavior.
Moving from the purely visual to the almost physical, we have to discuss textural contrast.
This one is fascinating because it seems to cross wires in the brain. We are talking about visual design, but textural contrast evokes a completely different sense of touch.
You are using visual cues to trigger a tactile memory. We all know what sandpaper feels like, and we all know what a wet pane of glass feels like. When a graphic designer prints a brochure using a dull, rough matte paper stock, but then applies a highly reflective, glossy UV varnish strictly over the logo.
Oh, I love when they do it. It feels so premium.
It does. The contrast between the dull, absorbent paper and the slick, raised gloss creates this massive amount of visual friction. It practically begs your brain to reach out and run your thumb over it.
It grounds the piece in the physical world. It makes it memorable because it engages multiple sensory memories, not just sight.
We see this in architecture constantly. An architect will create violent textural contrast by placing a sleek, mathematically perfect sheet of modern glass right up against a rough, jagged wall of natural stone.
Or cold, polished steel against brutalist, porous concrete. It's the tension of the materials that makes the building look expensive and deliberate.
It adds profound depth and dimension, which leads us to the most blunt instrument in the designer's toolbox: size contrast.
There is an old, somewhat cynical design adage: if you can't make it good, make it big.
It's a cliche,
Ow.
but it exists because it taps into a primal reality. Size contrast is the most proven, immediate technique for establishing visual hierarchy. Larger elements inherently convey a sense of dominance and importance. They yell.
And smaller elements.
Smaller elements suggest tertiary, subordinate information. They whisper.
Let's walk through a practical application of this from the text, because it's not just about making the logo bigger, it's about choreographing a viewer's physical experience over space and time. Imagine a poster for a local 2-minute film festival pasted on a brick wall downtown.
This is a great example.
A brilliant designer builds that poster by thinking about 3 distinct distances: what the viewer sees from 50 feet away, what they see from 10 feet away, and what they see from 2 feet away.
This is spatial storytelling. So, from 50 feet away, across a busy street with cars driving by, what is the only thing the human eye can process?
The massive elements. From 50 feet, you see a giant graphic of a hand holding up 2 fingers and a peace sign ripping through the background, and the enormous, bold words, 2-minute film festival. That's the hook. It's huge, it's high contrast, and it cuts through the urban noise. It makes you stop walking and look.
The size contrast has done its primary job. It shouted the core premise and grabbed attention. Now, the viewer is intrigued. They cross the street. They are now 10 feet away. What do they see?
Now the giant text is almost background noise, and their eyes adjust to the medium-sized elements. They read, "Second annual 24-hour competition," in a bold call-out. Anyone who has a camera, 2 friends, and 24 hours can enter and win $2,700 in prizes.
This is the secondary information. It provides context, stakes, and incentive. It answers the question, why should I care? And finally, they walk right up to the wall. They are standing 2 feet away.
That's when they see the absolute smallest elements on the poster. The dates, the registration website URL, the fine print about rules and upload formats, and the tiny sponsor logos at the bottom.
Now imagine if the designer didn't use size contrast. What if they made the dates, the rules, the prize money, and the title all the exact same 48-point font?
It would just be a gray wall of indecipherable text from 50 feet away. Nobody would ever cross the street to read it. Size contrast literally dictates the physical journey of the viewer. It feeds them the exact amount of information they're capable of processing at their given distance.
It is masterful manipulation, and it transitions perfectly into shape and spatial contrast.
Let's start with the psychology of shapes, because this is an area where consumers are manipulated every single day without realizing it. This blew my mind when I really started paying attention to it. Shapes, whether they are whole containers or just the underlying structure of a logo, carry profound psychological connections deeply rooted in our evolutionary biology.
They do. Let's unpack the big 3. Why do circles universally imply friendship, safety, inclusiveness, and unity?
Because in nature, a circle rarely poses a threat. A circle has no sharp edges. It cannot cut you or pierce your skin. It represents a gathering like a circle around a fire.
Right.
It represents a cycle, infinity, a soft berry, a human face. It is inherently welcoming and protective, which is why almost every logo for a community-focused brand, a charity, or a social platform utilizes circles or highly rounded typography.
Now, compare that to a triangle. Triangles convey action, direction, excitement, and aggression.
Right, because a triangle is essentially an arrowhead. It points. It implies speed and forward momentum. It is also the shape of teeth, claws, and thorns. Our reptilian brain registers sharp points as potential hazards or tools of action.
Furthermore, a triangle resting on one of its sharp points is visually unstable. It looks like it's going to fall over, which creates psychological tension. But a triangle resting on its flat base, like a parrot, is the most stable structure in existence. It represents dynamic, unstoppable energy.
Think about brands that want to project extreme aggressive energy. Look at the Doritos logo. It is literally a jagged, flaming triangle piercing through the text. It screams intense flavor and extreme action.
Or look at the Mitsubishi Motors logo, 3 sharp red diamonds pointing outward. It's pure aggressive engineering.
And then you have the square and the rectangle.
Squares represent comfort, discipline, reliability, tradition, and unwavering stability.
Because they are the building blocks of human construction. We build our world in right angles. Bricks, books, rooms, buildings, bank vaults. A square tells the subconscious brain, this is solid, this is structured, this will not change. It's why banks and insurance companies almost exclusively use square or heavy rectangular motifs.
So when a brand designer is choosing between a circular badge and a square badge, they are not making a superficial aesthetic choice. They're making a profound psychological declaration about what the brand stands for.
Okay, so we have the shapes. Now, how do we arrange those shapes in the empty space? That brings us to spatial contrast.
Spatial contrast is the deliberate manipulation of the empty space between elements, the positioning, the spacing, and the alignment. And the emotional impact of spacing is staggering. Tight spacing creates a feeling of urgency, intensity, and speed. Generous, open spacing creates a feeling of luxury, calm, and high value.
Think about the frantic environment of a stock market trading floor and look at how stock prices are displayed on a screen. The text is incredibly dense. It's tightly packed neon numbers scrolling aggressively with zero margins. It demands fast processing. It evokes a frenetic, high-stakes energy.
It raises your blood pressure just looking at it.
Yes. Now contrast that with the annual financial report of a multi-billion-dollar luxury fashion brand.
The difference is night and day. The luxury report is printed on heavy paper. The text is small and generously spaced. There are massive 2-inch white margins around everything. It breathes.
It tells the reader, take your time, this information is valuable, it is curated, and there is no rush. The absolute best real-world example of this spatial psychology right now is happening in the cannabis industry.
Oh, the shift in packaging design over the last decade has been a masterclass in spatial contrast.
Exactly. 10 years ago, the visual aesthetic of that industry was pure stoner culture. Neon colors, jagged fonts, illustrations of aliens or tie-dye patterns crammed into every square inch of the bag. It was visually loud and incredibly cluttered.
It was very niche.
But look at the premium CBD oils and organic hemp products on the shelves today.
The design elements on these new labels are emphatically not tightly spaced. They use clinical, clean typography, delicate line drawings of a single leaf, and massive amounts of negative space.
They use spatial contrast to completely reframe the product in the mind of the consumer. The generous, clinical spacing communicates that this is a natural, organic, high-end, luxury wellness product. More importantly, the empty space communicates safety.
Right.
It pivots entirely away from the cluttered, chaotic, recreational aesthetic and uses open space to say, this is a premium, tested, reliable supplement.
It requires a tremendous amount of discipline from the designer to leave that much canvas blank. It takes confidence to let the empty space do the heavy lifting.
Speaking of things that require discipline, let's look at the final frontier of contrast. Typographic contrast.
The manipulation of text,
Yeah.
using different typefaces, sizes, weights, and styles to create a clear hierarchy within the written word.
You see this all the time at local coffee shops. You look at a flyer for a local indie band, and it just visually hurts your eyes. It's not that the band photo is bad, it's that the text on the flyer is screaming at you in 5 different directions, and you can't figure out when the show actually starts. What is the actual mechanical failure happening there?
Novice designers almost always fail at typographic contrast, and it stems from a lack of restraint. The most common catastrophic mistake is using too many typefaces in a single design.
Oh, like 4 different fonts on one page.
Exactly. They use a grunge font for the band name, a typewriter font for the date, a cursive script for the venue, and a bold sans serif for the ticket price. It creates pure visual chaos. The brain gives up trying to decode the hierarchy.
But the opposite is also true, right? If they use the exact same standard font for everything, but just make the band name slightly bigger, it looks like a Microsoft Word document, not a poster. It lacks the friction needed to capture attention.
A professional designer establishes a clear, logical, and highly restricted hierarchy. They might pair a massive, thick, aggressive sans serif font for the headline with a highly legible, classic serif font for the paragraph text. 2 fonts doing 2 different jobs perfectly.
But typographic contrast isn't just about picking fonts, it's about the micro adjustments of spacing. We have to talk about kerning, tracking, and leading, because bad execution here causes literal reading fatigue.
Yes, the invisible details. Kerning is the specific space between 2 individual letters. Tracking is the overall spacing across an entire word or sentence. And leading is the vertical space between lines of text in a paragraph.
Bad kerning is a tragedy. If the letters are too far apart, the word falls to pieces and you read it as separate syllables. If the letters are too close together, they physically touch and form new, unintended shapes.
You have an example?
Yeah, I've seen billboards where the letters F and L were kerned so tightly together they looked like a capital U, which completely changed the meaning of the word in a very family-unfriendly way.
Oh no, that is exactly why designers obsess over it. And with leading the vertical space between lines, if the lines of a paragraph are crammed too tightly together, the eye loses its place when scanning back from the right side of the column to the left.
The reader physically tires out and just stops reading.
Adjusting these microspaces creates subtle typographic contrast that makes reading feel effortless.
Okay, so let's review our blueprint. We've used balance to build a stable foundation so our audience isn't anxious. We've used contrast color, size, texture, and typography to introduce friction, build hierarchy, and make things interesting. Now we arrive at the final act. Section 3, directing the performance, the power of emphasis.
Contrast provides the tools. Emphasis is the strategic, surgical deployment of those tools to tell the viewer exactly where to look first, second, and third. Emphasis is the creation of the focal point.
But there's a massive trap here, overemphasis. I like to think of this like a college freshman studying for their first big exam with a yellow highlighter.
Well, we've all been there.
Right. They start reading the textbook, they find an important sentence, and they highlight it. Then the next sentence seems important, so they highlight that too. By the end of the chapter, every single paragraph is glowing yellow. If you highlight everything, you're highlighted nothing. You've just changed the background color of the page.
That is the perfect metaphor. In design, using too many visual cues for emphasis destroys the hierarchy. If a button on a website is bright red and it's flashing and has a drop shadow and the text is bold and italicized and underlined and there are arrows pointing at it.
It looks desperate. It looks like spam.
It does. There's a brutal quote about this among copywriters in the book. Using too much emphasis is like explaining a punchline. It just makes the joke less effective.
It really shows a profound lack of confidence in the design. True emphasis requires ruthless restraint. You choose one, maybe two strategic cues, and you let the contrast do the work.
Let's look at a masterclass in this restraint. Let's talk about contrast emphasis in retail packaging, because a grocery store aisle is an absolute war zone for human attention.
Let's use the case study from the chapter for a beverage brand called Rascal.
The Rascal cans are a brilliant example of systemic emphasis. The designer had one primary goal: make the product name Rascal the absolute undeniable focal point from 10 feet away.
Right, because if you are scanning a cooler full of 100 different craft sodas and energy drinks, the brand name has to hit your brain first. So the designer made the word Rascal massive. But more importantly, they made the text pure, stark white. And they set that pure white text against incredibly vibrant, hyper-saturated backgrounds.
And they used color to differentiate the flavors, but kept the contrast extreme. The Lime Uprising flavor can is a chaotic, vibrant green background. Raspberry Riot is an intense magenta. Orange Craze is blazing orange. Berry Risky is deep blue.
This makes choosing your flavor instantly intuitive.
But here is the critical lesson. For that massive white text to achieve true emphasis, everything else on the can had to follow strict, cohesive rules.
Otherwise, it's just a colorful mess. So how did they build that cohesion?
Through disciplined repetition.
Yeah.
Across all 4 uniquely colored cans, the designer repeated the exact same secondary elements. There is a subtle illustration of a monkey in the exact same spot on every single can. The background colors all feature the exact same swirling texture.
Okay, I see.
The typography for the flavor names is identical. The legal information, the fluid ounces, the barcode is locked into the exact same pixel-perfect position. Because the background system was so strictly regimented and predictable, the pure white, massive Rascal logo was able to achieve explosive contrast emphasis.
It's like staging a theatrical play. If you want the lead actor delivering the monologue to command the spotlight, the entire chorus behind them has to stand perfectly, rigidly still. If the chorus is dancing around, the spotlight is wasted.
Exactly. The chorus provides the bass lines so the soloist can shine. Now, another incredibly effective way to create that spotlight without using loud colors is isolation emphasis.
This is the visual equivalent of a dramatic pause in a speech. It's taking a tiny element and surrounding it with a massive ocean of pure white space.
It forces the element to become the focal point, simply because there is absolutely nothing else competing for the brain's processing power. The eye is drawn to the anomaly in the emptiness.
Next, we have positional emphasis, which loops us right back to our earlier discussion about cultural context and learned behaviors.
Positional emphasis leverages the pathways our brains have been trained to follow since childhood. As we discussed in the US and Europe, the top left corner of any canvas is prime real estate. If you place a logo or a critical piece of information there, Western viewers will almost universally process it first.
You are hacking the audience's learned tendency to go to certain areas to look for information. It's highly effective. But the most primal, unlearned biological tool for emphasis is color.
The human optical system has to process millions of bits of sensory data every second, and it has to prioritize what might be a threat or a reward. Color is a biological cue that our brains prioritize above almost everything else.
We touched on this with the shapes, but let's go deeper into the physical reactions. A designer choosing a color palette isn't just decorating. They are playing with the viewer's autonomic nervous system.
They absolutely are. Empirical studies show that intense, warm colors, particularly saturated reds and oranges, can literally trigger an adrenaline response. They dilate the capillaries. They demonstrably increase human heart rates.
That is a staggering superpower. A graphic designer can alter your cardiovascular system with a hex code.
Conversely, cool colors like soft blues, greens, and muted purples have a demonstrable calming effect. They lower blood pressure, they signal safety and water. So when a designer wants to create emphasis, they use color anomalies to trigger these biological responses.
Right.
If you were designing a sleek, minimalist, dark gray website, and you make the Buy Now button a vibrant, glowing, saturated orange.
The brain sees that color anomaly, gets a tiny spike of adrenaline, and screams, "That is important, look right there." It makes the conversion process completely intuitive.
Exactly. Now let's look at the exact opposite of a glowing orange button. Let's talk about the sophisticated power of white space emphasis, or negative space.
And to clarify for everyone, it doesn't actually have to be the color white. It is simply the area of visual rest, the parts of the canvas where absolutely nothing is happening.
Many young designers are terrified of empty space. They view a blank corner of a canvas as a failure, a missed opportunity to add more information. They feel the need to cram every inch with graphics. But removing visual clutter is often the most powerful way to create intense focus.
Graphic designers use white space the way a composer uses silence between musical notes. The silence gives the notes their impact. White space allows the viewer to pause, reflect, and digest the information.
The ultimate example of emotional emphasis through white space from the book is the packaging design for a high-end moisturizing cream called Dew, created by designer Caroline Michel.
This case study is a masterpiece. Walk us through the psychology of this design. Imagine looking at this jar of cream.
The designer covered the packaging in a soft, watery, pale blue background, and instead of cramming the label with massive text boasting about ingredients or anti-aging claims, she used immense amounts of empty, watery space.
Very minimal.
Extremely. The only graphics are beautiful, delicate, minimalist illustrations of koi fish swimming around the jar and the tiny word "dew."
Let's analyze the koi fish. What do koi represent? They are never in a hurry. They glide slowly through tranquil ponds. They represent longevity, calm, and peace.
And what does a night cream represent to the consumer?
It represents the end of an exhausting day. It is the ritual of self-care. It's the moment you finally wash off the stress, lock the bathroom door, and your time is your own.
Exactly.
The designer strategically used massive expanses of empty space to literally mimic the unhurried, calm pace of that emotional state.
The absence of design elements is the design. The emptiness emphasizes the brand name by giving it room to breathe, but more importantly, it emphasizes the ultimate emotional promise of the product: tranquility.
It's so profound. It proves the old adage that less is more. Okay, we have two final tools for emphasis to cover. First, directional emphasis.
This is the literal guiding of the eye across the canvas using pathways, leading lines.
But it doesn't have to be a literal arrow drawn on the page, right? It can be incredibly subtle.
Oh, the best directional emphasis is invisible to the conscious mind. A designer can use the eye line of a model in a photograph. If the person in the ad is looking to the right, the viewer's eye will automatically follow their gaze to the right landing exactly on the product logo.
That's sneaky.
Or a designer can use a subtle Gaussian blur on the edges of an image, keeping only the center in sharp focus.
Or even a slight tint shift in a background gradient. The eye naturally travels from the darker shade to the lighter shade. You are gently pulling the viewer's eye exactly where you want it to go without them ever realizing they are on tracks.
It controls the movement of attention beautifully. And finally, we arrive at the ultimate long-term strategy for brand dominance: repetition and pattern emphasis.
Using repeated visual elements, specific colors, a proprietary font, a unique shape over and over again to build a rhythm that becomes intimately, neurologically familiar to the viewer.
Because familiarity builds comfort, and comfort builds trust. The brain burns fewer calories processing something it recognizes. When consumers encounter a problem, they reach for the solution that feels the most familiar.
There is a legendary business statistic regarding this principle in the book, and it centers around what might be the greatest print advertising campaign in history: the Absolute Vodka campaign.
It is the absolute gold standard for pattern emphasis. For 25 straight years, Absolute ran print ads that rely on one single, relentless visual pattern: the perfectly symmetrical, stout silhouette of their bottle.
They didn't show people partying. They didn't show tropical beaches. They just showed the shape of the bottle.
That's all I needed.
They made it out of snow. They made it out of Central Park from an aerial view. They made it out of bookshelves. Thousands of variations, but the exact same visual pattern every single time, anchored by a two-word headline: absolute perfection, absolute magic.
They achieved total, inescapable pattern emphasis, and the financial result of trusting that single visual principle. Over those 25 years, that repetition skyrocketed their sales from 10,000 cases a year to 4.5 million cases a year.
That is insane.
They became the top-selling imported vodka in the United States entirely off the back of rigorous visual repetition.
It proves that if you burn a consistent visual pattern into the mind of the consumer, you own a piece of their cognitive real estate forever.
It is the ultimate testament to the power of design principles.
Wow. Okay, let's zoom out and look at the landscape we just traversed. We started by building the foundation with balance, understanding how symmetry creates authority and how asymmetry creates dynamic energy by balancing visual weight, ensuring our audience doesn't feel physiological tension.
Right.
Then we explored how to wake the audience up using contrast, leveraging color, scale, texture, and typography to introduce friction, solve accessibility issues, and build hierarchy.
And finally, we learned how to dictate the viewer's journey through emphasis using isolation, biological color triggers, subtle directional lines, and the luxurious power of white space to tell the audience exactly what matters most.
It truly changes how you look at the entire constructed world around you. To our listeners, if you found this breakdown valuable, if you appreciate deep dives that treat you like an intelligent adult rather than just skimming a surface-level summary, please support the channel. Subscribe, share this with someone who would love it. Your support is the only engine that allows us to keep digging through these sources and bringing these insights directly to you.
It really has been a profound exploration of the hidden mechanics of our visual world.
It really has. I know I'm going to be scrutinizing every billboard and cereal box I see tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive, but before we go, I'm going to pass it over for a final thought to leave you with.
Now that you know the rules of this invisible physics, now that you understand how the generous use of white space can physically soothe your nervous system, how the sharp angles of a triangle can make your reptilian brain feel tension, how a designer can use tonal contrast to hide the fine print in plain sight, and how a specific shade of red can literally dilate your capillaries and increase your heart rate, you have to ask yourself a somewhat uncomfortable question. Tomorrow, as you walk down the grocery store aisle, as you scroll through your phone as you navigate your day, how much of what you choose to buy, read, or click on is truly your own free, conscious choice? And how much is just your brain helplessly, predictably, following the invisible, perfectly balanced breadcrumbs left by a master designer?
We'll let you think about that one. See you on the next deep dive.